In this video, I'll be responding to Judge Schmidt of the Majesty of Reason's critiques of the argument from arbitrary limits.
It's not clear to me why we should accept premise 1 as opposed to accepting, say, a PSR as restricted to simply contingent things. Not necessarily limited things, but just a PSR restricted to contingent things, which would allow for a foundational necessary thing that's limited in various ways. So that's one way that I would respond. It's just not clear to me that whatever is limited has an explanation. I would probably only go so far as to say that whatever is contingent requires an explanation, which would allow for there to be a necessary limited thing.
We have to ask why it would be limited in one respect as opposed to another respect. There couldn't be anything outside of it or more fundamental than it to place limitations upon it because it just is the foundation of reality. There couldn't be anything more fundamental or outside of it or foundational to it. It also wouldn't be able to pre-exist itself, to place limitations upon itself. Its nature wouldn't be able to pre-exist it in order to place limitations upon it because something can't pre-exist itself. But we then still have that question as to why it'd be limited in one respect as opposed to another respect. If there just is no answer to that, even in principle, then it doesn't seem like it would be necessary. The limitation would just simply be a brute fact. But the foundation is necessary, so its features can't be brute facts. So, at least by my lights, it seems most plausible that the necessary foundation would be entirely unlimited, except for features that themselves require limitations. A property like being made of wood. That type of property would require being limited by space. So the necessary foundation couldn't be made of wood because, again, that type of property would require a limitation in order to exist. The necessary foundation has no limitations, though, so it also wouldn't have properties which themselves would require limitations. But properties like being unlimited in space, unlimited in time, unlimited in power, unlimited in intelligence, unlimited in empathy, unlimited in moral value. Those types of features the necessary foundation would necessarily have to possess.
What I say is, in principle, it could be the case that every limited thing has an explanation, while something unlimited is impossible. Perhaps every contingent limited thing is ultimately explained in terms of a necessary limited thing, and the necessary limited thing is explained in terms of the metaphysical necessity of its existence, or, equivalently, the metaphysical impossibility of its non-existence.
In regards to whether the necessary foundation is impossible or not, it seems like the only two ways it could be impossible are, one, it's logically impossible, it's just an incoherent concept, but there's nothing incoherent about it. So the other way it would be impossible would be if it's metaphysically impossible. But the only way it could be metaphysically impossible is if it's necessarily limited. But I just explained why I don't think it would be necessarily limited, or it would be metaphysically impossible if there is a limited foundation that necessarily exists. But that's the same thing as saying the foundation would be necessarily limited.
And in that case, it could be quote-unquote unlimited with respect to its value or with respect to its goodness, but it would be unlimited in that respect simply because it is not the case that it has some limited degree of value or goodness or whatever. It's just the kind of thing to which value and goodness don't even apply. Similar to how God doesn't have any spatial limits, simply because he's not a spatial being. Of course, some people think that God is a spatial being, but set that aside. God isn't limited spatially, and the reason for that is because spatial properties don't even apply to God. So it's not as though God has some degree or extent of spatiality, and that degree or extent is limited. No, rather, such properties don't even apply to God. And similarly, something could be unlimited in principle, it seems to me, and yet nowhere near perfect because perhaps it simply has no axiological properties, and it's just not the kind of thing to which axiological properties would attach. Perhaps like something like the foundational universal wave function or quantum field.
Which is why I don't think something like a quantum field is a good candidate for a necessary foundation, because it is limited in its features. It would lack features like intelligence, consciousness, empathy, moral value, and so on. But a necessary foundation shouldn't have any limitations other than features which themselves require limitations in order to exist, like the property of being made out of wood. But intelligence, empathy, moral value, knowledge, and so on, those aren't those types of features that require limitations in order to exist, at least by my lights.
Arguably, God, or at least the Christian God, cannot be unlimited. This seems to infer that something is unlimited, and the idea is that this unlimited thing is God. But of course, the Christian God, I argue, cannot be unlimited. So first, the problem of Trinitarianism. So to be Trinitarian is to be limited in a certain respect. One is limited in one's number of persons. It's not 2, it's not 4, it's not 250, it's not infinitely many, it's exactly 3. And so God isn't, after all, unlimited if God is Trinitarian. Now, of course, one response that you're probably going to give, and one response that Josh himself gives, is that, oh, well, the foundational being simply can't have fundamental limits. It can have non-fundamental aspects or properties or features or respects in which it is limited in various ways. So it can have various non-fundamental limited aspects or properties or features and so on. It's just that those limits must be explained by or dependent upon or grounded in more fundamental features or aspects of the foundational being, and those fundamental features will be unlimited. But by my lights, that response is seriously problematic for several reasons. The first reason why that response is seriously problematic is that how are the persons then fully divine? Is aseity not a divine attribute? Is it not an essential divine attribute? Plausibly, aseity is a perfection, and so the persons would then be lacking a perfection, and so not, after all, God. So the Trinitarian problem still remains. Now, why would I say that they'd be lacking perfection? Well, because this argument is saying that any of these limits are non-fundamental. They're grounded in some positive ontological item, some more fundamental layer of the foundation as a whole. But in that case, these various non-fundamental aspects, the Trinitarianhood of this being, the fact that it exists in 3 persons, that's going to be grounded in something more fundamental than the 3 persons. And so the fact that there are 3 persons, it seems, this limit would then be grounded. It would be non-fundamental. It wouldn't be a se. It would be dependent on something else within God. But then it's exceedingly difficult to see how the 3 persons are fully divine, because then they seem to be dependent realities. Here's another way to see this. For any x, if x is God, then x is fundamental. That seems plausible. God is that than which nothing is more fundamental. God is the fundamental ground of reality or whatever. God is by nature fundamental, and so anything that is God is also fundamental. Now the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Spirit is God. So each of the Father and the Son and the Spirit are fundamental. But if each of the Father, Son, and Spirit are fundamental, well then God's being Trinitarian is likewise fundamental, since God's being Trinitarian just is a matter of existing in these 3 persons, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And so if these 3 persons are fundamental, so is God's Trinitarianhood. So it would follow that God's being Trinitarian is fundamental, which is of course incompatible with the response above. The response above that was just given says that no, actually, that limit, the fact that God is Trinitarian, God's Trinitarianhood, that's actually not fundamental, contrary to what we just derived.
Yes, God is limited to being 3 persons as opposed to a different number of persons. But the traditional understanding of the Trinity is that the second and third person, so the Son and Holy Spirit, are grounded within the first person, God the Father. So God the Father begets God the Son, and then, at least under the Nicene understanding of the Western Church, the Father and Son spirate the Holy Spirit. So the persons are explained by the necessary foundation, but this doesn't place a limitation upon the necessary foundation. Rather, the second and third persons are grounded by the first person. So they're grounded within that necessary foundation, but that doesn't limit the necessary foundation's other features. Now, in regards to the question of whether the Son and Holy Spirit would have the feature of being a se, or have the feature of aseity, that means existing on their own, their personhoods would not, because they would be grounded. But they're sharing the same substance or being that the first person has. So their substance is a se, because again, they're deriving their substance from God the Father ultimately. But their personhoods are not a se, because their personhoods are grounded. And one traditional understanding of the personhoods is that they are relations within God.
Once you say that the foundation can be fundamentally unlimited but non-fundamentally limited, what I want to say then is the naturalist can then say that the naturalistic foundation is limited in boatloads of respects, so long as they say that there are more fundamental aspects of the foundation which are unlimited, and which, in some way or another, explain its non-fundamental limits. And so then the argument here, the argument for limits, would then lose all of its force as an argument for theism. If to qualify as unlimited, you simply need to be fundamentally unlimited, but you can have various non-fundamental limited features and properties and so on, well then the naturalist can perfectly well accept that there is something unlimited, and it's not going to get you anywhere near something being perfect, because then it could be limited in boatloads of different respects, so long as those limited respects are explained in terms of a more fundamental layer of it, which is, let's say, just like thoroughly qualitative and unlimited.
To me, the difference, though, is that a Trinitarian theist can argue that the foundation is wholly unlimited and then grounds these further personal relations, which accounts for the trinity of persons. But that doesn't limit or take away its logically prior foundational unlimited features. Well, what the naturalist would have to argue is that the foundation is already limited because it lacks intelligence and so on, and then grounds further limits, or that the foundation was wholly unlimited, but then eliminates some of these unlimited features, eliminates its intelligence and empathy and moral value and so on. But it doesn't seem, at least by my lights, that something necessary features can be eliminated. So again, to summarize, the Trinitarian theist can argue that the foundation is wholly unlimited, but then grounds additional personal relations. But the naturalist would have to argue that the foundation is wholly unlimited and then eliminates its necessary features, which then accounts for it becoming limited. However, I don't think that necessary features can be eliminated, or the naturalist would have to argue that the foundation is limited and then grounds further limitations. But neither of those options is the same as what the Trinitarian theist is arguing. So I don't think the situations are like and like.
So plausibly, God can't be unlimited because his desires and his reasons, they vary in strength. They are in some sense degreed or on a spectrum.
In regards to God's desires being limited, God would have the desires that themselves don't require limitations. So desiring to drink water, desiring to rest, those types of features would themselves require limitations. Only a being that is limited in its health or strength or internal happiness could desire those types of things. It would have a lacking or a need. Otherwise, it wouldn't seek after those things. So God wouldn't be able to have desires like that, but a desire to share his love with other beings. That doesn't seem to require any sort of limitation. He wouldn't be seeking that in order to fulfill himself. He would be seeking it in order to fulfill other beings.
Again, because propositions are limited in various respects, right? The proposition that 1 + 1 = 2 is limited to being just about the number 1, the plus function, the equals function, and the number 2. It's limited in that way.
In regards to propositions or Platonic objects or concepts, abstractions, and so on, to me, they are clearly different than concrete features because an abstraction, just by analytic necessity, is restricted to being one way as opposed to another. The number 1 is necessarily restricted to being number 1 and not number 2. We can't imagine any fluctuation within the number 1. But with a concrete feature, we can ask, why is it this height as opposed to that height? Why does it have this power as opposed to that power? And so on. These features they can come in degrees, they can fluctuate, and that's why we can ask this question about limitation, but we wouldn't ask that, or at least I wouldn't ask that about an abstraction or a Platonic type object. So this is the end of my response. Joe does make additional points and elaborations that I don't respond to. I do recommend watching his video that I've linked in the description, and I don't consider my responses here to be decisive at all. Thanks for watching.